Demonic Adventures by Luke A. Martin. Chapter 1. Witch. Part 1. Home from work. A long time ago in the city of Sydney there was a beautiful woman and a handsome man. She was a slender woman with ginger hair and purple eyes. He was a tall man with grey hair and blue eyes. Her name was Betty and his name was Lexus. They have known each other for 14 years and had only been together for 7 of those years, with plans for marriage in the works. Betty did her own work at home, writing books with her typewriter. The stories she wrote and published were filled with witchcraft and monsters, and Lexus worked in a shop selling records and photographs in the Queen Victoria building. The hours were always long but bearable. Lexus would hardly wear any color, and if he did it would be limited to his shirt, tie, or scarf. As for Betty, she always wore bright color from her hat to her boots. She always chooses clothes that matched colors right to the shade. The main color that she would wear was purple, and she had many shades of purple in her wardrobe. If you were to look at Betty and Lexus, you would think that they were the most normal couple in all the city. And so they were, except for 2 little details. Betty was a witch with magical abilities right at her fingertips, and Lexus was a werewolf who transformed into a savage monster every full moon. When Lexus has transformed under the full moon, he becomes so strong that he could break down brick walls, bend metal, and does not die from normal bullets. And Betty uses magical spells and potions for her everyday needs. She could enchant a broom to sweep the apartment floor. She could mix a potion that can turn a person into something else. She could even change the weather itself by drawing a pentagram on the ground with chalk and containers of the 5 main elements: water, dirt, fire, electricity, and air. But you do not need to worry. Betty and Lexus are not evil at all. In fact, they use their abilities to help the world around them, as do most witches around the world. The thing you need to know about witches: they have their own government hidden from the non-magic world. It is there where they keep a close watch on the normal people around their local area and make sure that everything is kept in balance. As for werewolves, they do not target human flesh. They eat the meat of other animals, that being farm animals or wildlife. The year was 1906, which is when this story takes place. The story starts with Lexus serving his last customer for the day, selling a record cylinder. After the customer had left, Lexus went to the door of the shop and flipped the sign from open to closed, and he too leaves the shop, locking the door as he starts to walk home. As he exited the Queen Victoria building, he turns left towards Hyde Park. The streets had very few automobiles, or at the time they were called horseless carriages, that drove very slowly. Walking between the very thin traffic were thousands of pedestrians. Everyone was dressed formally and smart, the men wearing suits and trousers and the women wearing corsets under their dresses. Some were holding walking sticks and others were holding umbrellas to block out the hot Australian sun. On top of all that, there were trams rolling down the railway that cuts down the roads. Lexus walked past intersections, which have no traffic lights at the time. He passes Hyde Park, where the trees were just starting to grow, before he reaches an apartment unit on the right-hand side of the road in the direction he was walking. He makes his way inside and walks up the stairwell until he reaches level 6, where he walks down the hallway until he gets to room 605. As he walked into the room, he could hear a typewriter in use, which meant that his partner, Betty, was working hard yet again. He hangs up his jacket and hat before he goes into the study to see her. "Betty," he says, "I'm home." "Oh, hello, Lexus," she replied without turning around. She was deep in concentration with this new book she was writing. He decides to leave her alone and let her do her writing. So he walks into the bedroom, where he starts to take off his vest with his pocket watch inside. He then kicks off his boots before he unbuttons his shirt, showing a muscular chest covered in a thick layer of gray hair. After doing that, he lands on the bed so that he can finally rest after 7 hours of non-stop work at his shop. He seemed to drift off for a few minutes, because the next thing he knew, Betty was at his side stroking his chest hair, which is what woke him up. "I'll never forget how tough you are, dear," she said. "You're referring to the time you saw me in the bush last time I transformed?" he asked. "I told you before. I can handle seeing you in your savage form. How's the writing going?" "Actually, I just finished the first chapter. Did you want to have a read?" Of course, Lexus accepted and got out of bed to read the pages that Betty had typewritten on. The first thing that he noticed was the title, Woman in the Night. He reads the first 2 pages and nods, impressed. "I notice the main character is based on Daisy," he said. "Well, she is the only person we know who is in fact a vampire," Betty replied. "You've been writing one book for each mythical being with near-human intelligence. You've even done a ghost story based on Miles. Not everyone knows about him." Just then Betty looks out the window, as if she had just seen something. "What is it?" Lexus asked. "Elkings," she replied. "Attacking some woman, Elkings." "Here. Who would create those creatures in broad daylight?" "I don't know. But that woman needs help." Betty was just about to head out the door when Lexus grabbed her, telling her, "You can't just use magic in front of humans in the middle of the day." Betty puts her hand on Lexus's, where he was holding her, and tells him to not worry. "I'm always careful. I'll give her amnesia before anything bad happens." After hearing that, Lexus lets Betty go to do what she needs to do. She walks out of the apartment unit and stands on the side of the road, where she closes her eyes and concentrates on the woman being attacked by Elkings. And after she feels where she is, she starts to quickly walk in that direction. Part 2. Saving the Woman. Betty walked across the road and into an alleyway where no one can see her when she sees what she was looking for. A woman in a green dress stained in blood being attacked by some kind of monster. It was a large furry creature with red and black fur. Its eyes were bright yellow. Its teeth were feline-like, and there were 2 pairs of horns on top of its head. "Looks like a scarlet Elking," Betty thinks to herself. "Why would someone create one of those just to strike in the daytime?" The woman who was on the floor was trying to scream for help, but there was no sound coming out of her mouth. "A sound snatcher too," Betty says, and she starts wiggling her fingers, which was warming up her magic. She then points one finger at the Elking, and a bolt of electricity fires from her fingertip and strikes the Elking, going right through its leg, bringing it to the ground. Betty then reaches into her handbag that she brought with her and pulls out a small glass bottle. She opens it as she walks towards the Elking and sprinkles the liquid onto it, which makes it dissolve into vapor. The woman that Betty had just saved tries to stand up, asking, "What on earth was that? How did you do that?" "I see your voice has returned," Betty replies. "You don't need to worry. I'm a witch and I'm here to help." Not that it even matters if I tell you what I am or not. You're a witch. You're an agent of Satan himself. Trust me, if I wanted to kill you, you'd already be dead. Betty then notices the wounds on the woman's arm. If you come with me, I'll heal you, Betty says. I have lots of healing potions at home. Why would a witch want to help a human? The woman asked, because witches are basically humans, we're just more spiritually aware. Now, unfortunately for you, you have already seen far too much, so if you just hold still and Betty snaps her fingers, and the woman falls asleep right on the spot. She then reaches into her handbag again and pulls out a clear fabric, which she then throws over the woman, which makes her disappear. Betty then uses her magic to levitate the now invisible woman, so she could take her to the apartment unit without anyone seeing. After she quickly walked back to the apartment unit and climbs up the stairwell, she unlocks and opens the door to room 605 without touching it. As soon as the door is closed and securely locked, she takes the fabric off the woman, making her visible again. Lexus sees that Betty had brought the woman into the apartment with her. What are you thinking? He asked. Why would you bring a human here? The Erlking was a scarlet sound snatcher, Betty replies. It gave her these fatal wounds. I couldn't just take her to the hospital. I see. As long as you remember the amnesia. Betty brings the still unconscious woman to the guest bedroom, right across the hall from the master bedroom, where she lays her on the bed so she could get started with fixing her. Suddenly a small green creature that looked like a person-shaped grasshopper with wings, antennae, and large black compound eyes flies into the room through the window and lands on the chest of drawers next to the bed. Betty then turns to the creature saying, Clover, get me some self-repair, some anti-magic, some germ killer, and a bandage roll. The insect-like creature then flies into the bathroom right for the medicine cabinet and gets the bottles of potions that Betty had asked for, bringing them to her one at a time before it fetches a roll of white cloth and places it on the bedside table. First, Betty takes the bottle of anti-magic, which was a drop. She sprinkles a few drops of the potion on each of the wounds before she gets the germ killer and pats it on her. Finally, the self-repair potion was a spray that she aimed from 10 centimeters away with short sprays before she wraps up the wounds with the cloth. But just as she had finished up, the woman starts to wake up. When she realizes that she was in someone else's apartment, she starts to worry until she notices Betty at her side. Hi Cecilia, Betty says. How are you feeling? The woman Cecilia tries to move her arm where the bandage is wrapped around, but it feels numb. Suddenly she realizes something. How do you know my name? She asked Betty in concern. Not that it even matters if I tell you or not, because you're going to forget everything about meeting me or being attacked by that Erlking. Cecilia's eyes widen in horror as she remembers Betty's face. Are you a witch? She asked with her voice stuttering. Betty makes a quiet chuckle with her head lowered. Everyone believes that witches are evil, don't they? She asked sarcastically. Well, I can promise you this. I'm definitely not one of the wicked ones. After all, I'm the one who saved you, aren't I? You're confessing. You are a witch. Just then Cecilia sees the insect-like creature standing on the foot of the bed she was lying on and screams at it. What is that thing? She asked. There's nothing to fear, Betty replies. Her name is Clover. She's a fairy. Cecilia looks at Betty with confusion. A fairy? She asked. Fairies aren't real. Well, that's not true because there's one right there. Now you need some rest. Betty then snaps her fingers once again, and Cecilia falls right to sleep on the guest bed. Betty then leaves the guest bedroom and closes the door, casting a locking spell on it so that it can only be opened when the spell is lifted. Part 3. The Visitors. Betty walks into the lounge room where Lexus is reading the newspaper that arrived earlier that morning. As she enters, he asks her if Cecilia had any trouble processing the fact that she was in the house of a witch. Most humans are hard to convince, she replied. This one's no different, and you're sure you can fix things? Lexus asked, right now, all I really care about is who created that Erlking and why. Whoever it was must have been extraordinarily powerful, because that kind of magic is one of the most advanced. Just then the apartment door swung open, and two men walked inside. One was an overweight man with blonde hair and a mustache, wearing a brown suit and a Homburg. The other was a taller and skinny man with black hair and a goatee, wearing a dark green suit with a derby. As they walk in, the man in the brown suit says to Betty, "Hey, have you heard the news?" Betty looks confused. News? What are you talking about? She replied, Kaiwan is coming to our country as we speak, said the man in the green suit. You mean the Egyptian witch? Lexus asked. She's the most powerful one in Africa. Why would she come here? Does it matter? Betty asked sarcastically. Asher, Tobias, you two need to leave. Why? Asked the man in the green suit. Asher, I'm just very busy right now. Betty has company. Lexus added. Oh, your brother's here? Asked the man in the brown suit. Tobias, no. She's just someone who needed my help. Asher looks over at Betty in an interested way, asking, Hold on, there's a woman here. She's not a witch, in case you were wondering, Lexus replied, and Asher looks disappointed. Just then there was another man walking into the apartment, a thin man in a blue vest and a fedora with full moon glasses, and a hood-like garment under it which covered his ears. As the newcomer enters, he closes the door, takes off his hat, and pulls down his hood, revealing his ears, which were large and round like a mouse, with crops of hair at the corners making them look pointed. Agnes, asked Lexus with shock, what are you doing here? A simple hello would do, replied the newcomer. Agnes in an Irish accent. As he opens his mouth he shows that he has buck teeth from the top. Hope you don't mind, but I brought someone over. And just as the door closed there was another man walking through the very wood of the door. This one was very different from the rest. He was wearing a fashion trend that was from the 1790s at latest. I shalt only repeat once, he said in a medieval English vocabulary, for I need not of you to bring me forth. He told Agnes. Hello Miles, Asher said to the 1790s man. Miles, what brings you here after all this time? I thought you'd be with Daisy. Asked Tobias. I gazed upon the Erlking that Betty fought and saved a dear maiden, Miles said. Everyone, but Lexus, looks at Betty in confusion. What's this about? Asked Agnes. That company you have is a victim of an Erlking. Tobias asked. That's what I've been trying to say. Betty replies, yes, she was a victim of some powerful witch, but I don't know who it was. I couldn't take her to the hospital after I saw her injuries. That's why she's here, so that she can heal without getting suspicious. As they were talking, the door to the guest bedroom opened and Cecilia stepped out, still with a bandage wrapped around her arm, where she was grabbing in pain. She had just heard everything about Betty bringing her here to recover, and just like that she understood, this witch was not evil at all. "So, you were telling the truth?" she asked Betty, who was still surrounded by the other 4 visitors. Betty looked down the hallway at Cecilia in shock. She did not understand. She was supposed to be asleep, because she put a sleeping spell on her. "Just how long do you intend on keeping me here for?" Cecilia asked. "Boys," Betty said. "May I introduce Cecilia?" Cecilia looked at each of the men. She could not see Miles at all. And when she noticed Agnes had mouse-like ears, she froze. "What are you?" she asked him. "Don't you mean who?" he replies. "My name is Agnes. I'm an elf from Ireland. You may be aware of my people. You called us leprechauns." She looked at him, still shook up. "I thought you casted a sleeping spell on her," Lexus asked Betty, who replies, "I did. I must have miscounted the time I wanted." "Well, what about the locking charm? How long were you going to keep me under that spell?" Cecilia asked, trying to build up her courage. "Only long enough to let your wounds heal," Betty replied. "If no better, I did not." Miles says, "I would say that this fair maiden thou has rescued be immune to magic." Cecilia suddenly starts to look around the room, left, right, and center, as if she had just seen something, and is trying to find it again. "Who said that?" she asked. Miles, still unseen by Cecilia, walked right up to her face and said, "I did," and just like that Cecilia lets out a scream. "Wait," Asher says, "you can hear him." "I hear someone who isn't visible," Cecilia replies, now holding her hands to her ears. "That's not possible for a human to hear a ghost," Tobias said with concern. Betty then steps closer to Cecilia, and looks into her mind through her eyes, trying to find any signs of magical energy that might have been left behind by the Erl King. "It seems that the breath of the Scarlet Sound Snatcher has temporarily altered your biology," she told Cecilia. "What does that mean?" she asked Betty. "It means you need to drink some anti-magic." Betty then calls out for Clover the fairy and tells her to get one of the bottles that she used earlier, the one with anti-magic. As the fairy is getting the bottle, Betty has gone into the kitchen and poured a glass of water. When Clover gives the potion to Betty, she puts 3 drops of it into the water and gives it to Cecilia, telling her that it will fix her. Cautiously she sniffs the water first. There was a smell of eucalyptus. When she asked what it really was, Betty asked back, "Why don't you just trust that I'm trying to help you? Everyone believes that us witches are evil souls. That's why," Tobias answered for Cecilia. "It's going to make you get better faster," Betty tells her, pointing at the water with the potion in it. Cecilia, who was still not fully trusting of these people, takes a small sip, and then drinks the whole glass. "Go on, Miles," Lexa says. "Say something." Miles walked up to Cecilia's ear and says, "Hello, fair maiden, can thou hear me? Speak forth." Cecilia did not respond this time at all, which meant that she could not hear Miles anymore. Betty looks at Cecilia's arm where the Erl King had harmed her, and could not help but notice that she was now moving it without any trouble at all. "Let me see your arm," she asked Cecilia, who looked at Betty with suspicion. She asked, "Why?" and Betty replies, "That self-repair I used on your wounds was maximum strength, so it should have finished by now." Cecilia looks at her with confusion. as she starts to unwrap the bandages until she could see the skin on her arm. The wound had healed up and there was no sign of a scar. Amazed and freaked out at the same time, Cecilia thanks Betty and apologizes. "I was wrong to believe that witches are evil. I wish I could change the way people see you." "We all do," Agnes replied. "Unfortunately, that's not how the government works in this world," Asher added. "Nor is there understanding of the afterlife," Miles said to Tobias, who gives him a nod. "You know what else is unfortunate, Cecilia?" Betty asked. "The fact that you've already seen far too much. So, even though you understand us now, I'm afraid I'm going to have to amnesia you." "Excuse me?" Cecilia asked with concern. "I mean you need to forget everything about this afternoon, the Erlking attack, the fairy, everything in this room you need to forget." Just then Asher grabs Betty's shoulder, asking if it was really necessary. "She does understand us now, even if she does know how witches really live. We can't risk a human walking around with this kind of knowledge," Betty replied, as she starts wiggling her fingers, warming them up for magic. "Betty," Agnes says, "it may be too late. I mean that she sees us as good souls now. That amnesia spell only works on bad memories. The Erlking will definitely go, but I'm not so sure about the rest." After hearing that, Betty stops wiggling her fingers, as she realized that Agnes was right. "I won't tell another soul," Cecilia says to them. "I can promise you that." "I trust her," said Tobias. "I hope thou art right," Miles said to him. "You need to leave now," Lexis tells Cecilia, who goes back into the guest bedroom, gets dressed back into her streetwear that was now magically cleaned of blood, and makes her way to the door where Agnes is waiting to open for her. Before she leaves, she turns back, asking if they will ever meet again. "I guarantee it," Asher replied. "You can find us anywhere," Lexis added. "You just need to look in the right places," Betty tells her. "The shadows." Cecilia nods to them, saying thank you and good night, and she walks out the door and leaves the building. Part 4. She's back. A couple of days have passed, and Cecilia was true to her word. She had not told anyone, not even her husband, that she had seen an apartment room filled with witches. That morning Lexis stands in the master bedroom, looking out the window at the city beyond. It's been 2 days, he tells himself, and no one has been burnt at the stake yet. "That's a good sign," said Betty, who had just entered the room with the new book she was writing. Lexis turns to meet eyes with Betty and asks, "You're going to publish it?" "This vampire story is probably the greatest one yet," she replied. "How did you finish it in 2 days?" "When I have a good story, I don't stop until it's done." The book was still very thin, but Lexis knew that it was a good story. Everything that Betty had written was great. When the clock struck 8, Lexis went off to his job at the shop and Betty went to the local publishers with her book in her handbag. As Lexis arrived at the Queen Victoria building, he got a whiff of something. He sniffed the air, trying to find out what the smell could be. Whatever it was, it smelled very familiar. And not in a good way. It smelled like dark magic. He takes a quick look around to see if anyone in the crowd was doing anything suspicious. And to his relief, there was no sign of an evil witch anywhere. Either they have already gone, or they are invisible. Either way, the smell had gone. Hours passed and Betty had managed to start getting her book published. After paying the publisher, she left. But just as she walked out the door, she could feel something, like something or someone was reaching inside her head. Her head starts to ache, and her ears start to ring. She speaks telepathically, "Who are you?" But there was no answer. She starts to breathe heavily as the pain in her head and ears get worse. It was that moment she understood who it was. Starting to panic, she makes a run for it straight for the trams, and she hops on one just as it was leaving. As the tram moves, the pain and ringing starts to fade. While standing on the moving tram, she noticed something posted on a door frame of a building. She got a quick look at what it is. It was a missing poster for a little boy named Austin. She read the name of the parents, and to her disbelief, she saw Cecilia's name on the poster as the mother. "I need to see Cecilia right now," she thinks to herself. Later, Betty walks into another apartment unit and goes straight to level 3, room 8. She knocks on the door 6 times and waits for an answer. "Who is it?" said Cecilia's voice from inside the door. "It's me, Betty. Open the door now." Betty heard Cecilia open the locks on her door before she finally opened it. "What is it?" she asked with concern. "Did you run into anyone 2 days ago, before you were attacked by that Erlking?" Betty asked as if she was in a hurry. "Who's at the door?" asked a man's voice from inside the room. Cecilia turns around and shouts out, "It's just a friend of mine." Betty, she turns back to her and apologizes, telling her that man was her husband. "When did your son go missing?" Betty asked. "You saw the posters?" Cecilia asked back before answering. "That day you saved me from that fiend, we soon noticed that Austin was missing. He's been missing for 2 days." Betty asks, "Did you talk to anyone on the streets before you were attacked?" Cecilia looks at Betty with confusion as she answers, "Yes, I did. She was a homeless hag, selling apples on the streets. Based on how she talked, she was Scottish." Betty starts to look terrified, and she starts to breathe heavily as she tells Cecilia, "Keep your door locked and your windows barred. Only leave home for work or groceries, and stay off the streets as much as you can." And she turns around and leaves. Cecilia looks more confused at the commands that Betty had just given her. "What?" she asks. "Why? Who is that woman? Is she a witch? Don't talk to anyone else. Just stay home." Betty shouts at her as she starts to run down the stairwell and back outside. Later, she rushes inside her apartment unit into room 605 to find Lexus already home. "Lexus, we need to get out of here, right now," she told him. "You sensed it too, didn't you?" he asked. "Yes, it's the same witch who created that Erlking 2 days ago." They both start taking suitcases and stuffing them with clothes and toiletries and other essentials. As they finish packing, Lexus picks up the telephone and calls the Sydney rail station. "Hello. How can I help you?" asked the station employee on the other end of the call. "I need 2 one-way tickets on the next train to Wollongong," Lexus asked. "That train will be leaving in 3 hours. I'll take it." "Okay, that will be £400 for each ticket. Can I have a name for the ticket?" Lexus was confused. "I'm sorry, £400. I asked for one way. Either you pay the £400 each, or the tickets get refunded." Lexus starts to get frustrated as he hangs up the phone. She's already gotten to the train tickets, he tells Betty. "She's trying to stop us from leaving." "Let me guess, £400. How do you?" "I know her. We don't have that kind of money just for 2 train tickets. But there is someone who does. The sun was just starting to set when Lexus and Betty make their way to another apartment unit, where they let themselves in. Betty uses her magic to unlock the front door, and they quickly walk up the stairwell to level 4, and walk down the hallway to room 414. Lexus bangs on the door for someone to open it. When the door opens, there was just a really dark room, and there were 2 red eyes looking at them from inside. "Betty?" "Lexus?" asked a woman's voice, and the eyes moved out from the dark and into the light, where they saw the face of a pale-skinned woman with a bald head, needle fangs, and dressed in a completely black dress. "Daisy, we need some money," Betty said. Daisy looks at her with confusion as she replies, "Why would you come to me? I thought the home of a vampire is the last place a witch would ever go for help. We need to leave town right now." Lexus tells her, "You 2 cut me out of your lives," Daisy says, "and now you want my money to leave town." Lexus lets out a sigh of frustration and tells Betty that this was a bad idea. "Come on, let's find somewhere else to get the money." They start to leave, but Daisy tells them, "No. You came to me for a reason. So, what is it? Why did you come here?" Betty turns around to face the vampire and tells her she's back. Daisy presses her fingers to her eyes as she tells them it's been 6 years. "We watched her die. We made sure she was dead. We were wrong, Daisy." Lexus replied, "She created an Erlking that attacked a human woman. She took her son." Betty added, "That's what those posters are." Daisy asks, Betty nods, and Daisy starts to look worried. "I'm calling the night watchers," she tells them as she turns around and starts to walk back into her apartment. But Lexus stops her, telling her, "They can't help us. You know what she's capable of. So, you 2 are keeping out of her reach?" she asked. "Yes. We are," Betty replied. "If she gets her hands on us again, Sydney is doomed." Daisy looks into Betty's eyes and asks, "If you leave?" But she cuts her off, asking, "Well, what would you do?" "I would fight her until either one of us is dead for good." "You would?" Betty asked. "She is stronger than all of us." "But what about all of us put together? We tried that before, and we barely survived." Lexus replied, "But this will be different because this time we have an elf on our side." Lexus and Betty look at each other in wonder as they start thinking the same thing. Agnes would be helpful to them. After all, elvish magic is more powerful than witches' magic. All right. Betty decides, "Get the whole team together. We are going to save that boy." Part 5. At the hotel. Betty leads the way back to the front door of the apartment, followed by Lexus and Daisy, who was now wearing a black wig to cover her bald head, and round glasses, which make her red vampire eyes look like normal human eyes. Just as they were approaching the door, Lexus stops and sniffs the air. He turns to the mailboxes and sniffs. There was a stench of what seemed like rotting meat and maggots. "This is her," he said as he pointed to Daisy's mailbox number 414. Daisy opened it and reached inside, pulling out a letter in a black envelope sealed with black wax. She opens the envelope and looks at the parchment within. "It's an address for a hotel," Daisy said. Betty and Lexus share a concerned look, because they know it's a trap, but they knew they had to go there to save Cecilia's son. Lexus heads outside and runs straight for the nearest telephone booth, where he makes a call to Asher, Tobias and Agnes, telling them to meet him and Betty at the hotel. Meanwhile, Betty asks Daisy to call Miles the ghost because vampires can communicate with ghosts telepathically. After they have made all the calls, Lexus calls a taxi carriage to take them to the hotel. When they arrive, they see that the two male witches and the elf are already there. The ghost has just arrived himself. "What's going on?" asked Asher. "You remember Cecilia?" Betty asked back. The four nod their heads with concern. "Well, her son has been missing for 2 days. And we think we know who kidnapped him," Lexus added. "A child." "Kidnapped?" asked Agnes. "People still do that, I knew not," Miles replied in his medieval English vocabulary. "Who was it?" Asher asked. Daisy takes the envelope from her handbag that came in her mail. She showed it to the boys, and they all looked fearful at the sight of the black envelope. "She's back?" Tobias asked with a small stutter in his voice. "I fear so," Betty replied. "You're talking about Juliet?" asked Agnes, "the Dark Witch. I heard stories about her. She was supposedly the most evil person who ever lived and died. She terrorized entire countries with her Erlkings." Miles looks at Agnes in a puzzled way. "Dead she cannot be, for there be no mention of her in afterlife," he said. "She could have been spiritually erased," Tobias suggested. "Boys, she's still alive somehow," Betty says, "and chances are she's inside that hotel with Cecilia's son." She points at the building behind the boys. Lexus then turns to the path that leads to the front door of the hotel. "We've got to save him," he said, "and we've got to finish her for good." Daisy added, "What are you thinking?" Asher asked. "We can do this." Betty replies, "We've fought her before, and we defeated her. We only just made it out alive." Asher told them, "If we defeated her once before, we can do so again," said Lexus. "Not to mention the fact that we have an elf with us this time," Betty adds, "and elves are more powerful than witches. I'm sure you two already knew that." She indicates Asher and Tobias. The two boy witches look scared out of their skin. Miles the ghost has his hand over his mouth with stress, whereas Agnes the elf looks as if he was deep in thought. "All right," said Agnes, "you barely survived last time because I wasn't with you. So, if we join our forces, we should have a real chance of defeating her once and for all." Lexus thanks Agnes for being on board with this little rescue mission. He then turns to Asher and Tobias, asking if they were joining them or not. "You know I've always got your back, Lexus," asked Asher. "We'll be fine as long as we are all together," Lexus replies. Asher nodded his head in agreement, and Lexus turned to Miles, asking if he was in. "Well, news of good be that kill me she cannot, for I already be dead." Miles was on board. All that was left was Tobias to agree, as he thinks he realizes that everyone has already agreed except for him, so he says, "Oh damn me, fine, I'm in." That was it. Everyone had agreed to join the rescue mission. Betty walked up to the now locked front door, and with a wiggle of her fingers and a wave of her hand, she magically unlocked the wooden door, and they all walked cautiously inside. They all look around the empty lobby, trying to find anything out of the ordinary. "Which room do we need to go to?" Agnes asked quietly. Room 116. Daisy replied, "How does thou know that?" Miles asked, "It was in the letter she sent me," which clearly means that even though the child is here, it's still going to be a trap. Betty added, "Any sign of her Lexus?" He sniffs the air and gets mixed signals. "The child's definitely here," he says. "As for her, I keep getting her stench coming and going. I can't tell if she is here or not." They start to climb the stairs to the first floor, where they walk down the hallway towards room 116. Lexus takes in another whiff of air. "He's in there. Keep on your toes," he told everyone. Betty walks slowly up to the room door, magically unlocks it, and slowly opens it ajar, which was enough to see the bed, where she sees a little boy lying on it wide awake. Taking another look around, she opens the door even more and cautiously steps inside the room. "Is she here?" she asked the boy. "Is Juliet here?" The boy weakly opens his mouth and replies, "No." Betty lets out a great sigh and tells the rest of them to come in. "How long has it been since she left?" she asked the boy, who was staring at the grandfather clock at the far side of the room. "One day, 10 hours, and 52 minutes, he replied. "Who are you?" "We are friends of your mother's. We are here to take you home. Now get up, we are leaving." "I can't move," the boy said weakly. Lexus walked up to the boy and asked him, "She cursed you, didn't she?" Meanwhile Asher had made his way to the telephone and dialed Cecilia's number. "Cecilia, we've found your son," he says into the phone. "You have to keep him inside as much as possible. Go straight to Betty's apartment. We'll meet you there." And then he hangs up just as something forces him into the wall, and then sends him flying into another wall on the opposite end of the room. "She's here!" Tobias shouted right before the bathroom door opens, and an old woman with grey hair wearing an all-black dress steps out. "Juliet," Betty said, "did you really believe that I was gone?" asked the woman. Juliet in a Scottish accent, "I knew that kidnapping that child would draw you all out. And now, prepare to die," and she fires a bolt of electricity from her right hand, which Betty only just manages to deflect and return fire. But Juliet redirects the bolt and it almost hits Lexus in the head. "Hey!" Asher called out, as he just managed to stand up again, "Pick on someone your own size." Juliet then fires a bolt at him, but he counteracts by shooting his own bolt right into the path of hers. Their two bolts hit one another in the middle, causing a powerful electric blue light on impact. While that happened, Agnes has snuck up behind Juliet and prepared for attack. He throws a ball of blue fire at her, but she notices it and freezes the flames quickly. But she did not realize that Lexus and Daisy have closed in on her from one direction, and they both punched her as hard as they can at the same time, which sent her crashing out the window and falling to the streets below. Tobias runs to the now smashed window and peers out at the streets below. There was no sign of her body. It was as if she had never fallen. That could only mean one thing. She had gotten away, and she was still out there somewhere. Daisy looks at the boy, who was now in a panic, almost scared out of his skin and holding back a scream. "What are you?" he asked as he started to cry. "We are friends," Daisy told him, as she took off her glasses and looked right into the child's eyes with her natural red vampire eyes. She tells the boy to sleep, and he just nodded off right there on the spot. Lexus then picked up the kid and started to leave with everyone following. "We'll have to move fast through the alleyways," he says. "We can't risk anyone seeing us with a kid like this." And they make a run for it into the shadows and back to Lexus and Betty's apartment. As soon as they make it to the apartment room, Tobias locks and bolts the door, while Lexus takes the boy to the guest room and lays him on the bed. Daisy walked up to him and reads his mind while he is still fast asleep. "I'll have to wipe his memory about the encounter he had with her," she tells them. "But I'm afraid it won't stop him from having nightmares about it." She then places her hand on the boy's head and takes away the bad memories he had over the past 2 days. "He'll be okay," said Daisy, "and you're sure that he won't remember?" Asher asked. "Vampire telepathy is way stronger than any other species with that power," Lexus replied. Just then they hear a knock on the door and Cecilia's voice asking Betty, "Is my son in there?" Miles peeks outside by poking his head through the closed wooden door to make sure that it was actually Cecilia, and it was her. They unlock the door just as the sleeping spell wore off and the boy wakes up. As soon as Cecilia sees her son, she almost cries as she holds him tight. "Austin, my darling boy," she says, "where have you been all this time?" "He'll be okay," Betty tells her. "You just need to keep him away from the witch who took him." Cecilia looks towards her with confusion. "Which?" "She got away. Right now, your only concern is keeping Austin inside as much as possible, and never let him out of the apartment unless absolutely necessary." Cecilia thanks Betty with a gracious hug. She then gives the same hug to Lexus, and she notices Daisy, who was standing right behind him. "And who are you?" she asked. "A friend." "And that's all you need to know," Daisy replied. Cecilia then grabs Austin's hand, telling him that they were going home. "I'll walk you home," Tobias suggested, "just in case there's another attack." "Good thinking," Betty replies. "Make sure they get home safely." And Tobias leads Cecilia and Austin downstairs and outside.